So our spending, if you couple the, 10, 20%, whatever the inflation has been since COVID, plus the fact that we've had 2 children and now we're thinking about getting new homes and we're sending the kids to school and we're paying for food and diapers and daycare and everything that goes along with it. If you don't think the economy benefits from that, you're kidding.
Yeah.
So it will be interesting over the next few years. We've got millennials that have good home equity, that have rising wages, that have growing families. And a lot of that points to a strong economy.
Well, yeah, good morning, everybody. It is January 22nd, this wonderful year of 2024. Excited to be here. Thank you for listening to the Money Alchemist podcast. I'm one of your hosts, Ben Jones with National Wealth Management Group.
And I'm Brent Gargano with Infinite Wealth Planning.
Thank you for being here today. Brent, how was your weekend? What did you get into?
It snowed here this weekend. So my kids, who haven't had a whole lot of experience with snow, got to go out in the snow. And my 4-year-old daughter thought it was great. She was way into it. My 2-year-old son got out there and it was too cold for him. So he just started crying. So we all hung out inside and that was pretty low key.
Yeah, that tracks. You know what I find hilarious is, so the amount of snow that we got on Friday wasn't a lot. How many inches did we get? It was I think
I got 4 inches, 3 inches,
okay.
Maybe. Not a ton.
It always confuses me. They say inches because I go out there, when I look at it, if it doesn't cover the grass, if the grass blades are still sticking out. I still had
grass blades through it.
Yeah. Then I would say at most you're talking 2 inches.
I cut my grass high.
Yeah, well, I do too. I cut mine at 3.5 to 4 inches, but. Anyway, so we got a pretty decent amount, but it wasn't a lot. The Canadians would laugh at us. But what's funny is that everybody shuts down. They're like a little bit of snow, the first snow of the year, which this is actually the first snow that we've had this winter in Cincinnati. Yeah. So the first snow of the year, they will just shut down everything. And then we'll end up with no school. People will cancel appointments. I had 3 appointments, all of them rescheduled. Kids didn't have school. But then if we had 2 or 3 more snows just like that, and it would be disruptive, people were like, oh no, we're not worried about it anymore. So it's like the first snow of every year it's almost like a guaranteed impromptu holiday. Well, you know what I'm saying?
I grew up in Charlotte, North Carolina.
Yeah.
And my joke is that Charlotte is too far north to where it actually gets snow from time to time, but far enough south to where they have no idea what to do with it. So in Charlotte, I mean, if you got 1/4 of an inch of snow, you were crazy if you went out. We had snow days at the drop of a hat when I was a kid. As I got older and we moved to Cincinnati, when I worked at Fidelity, they have a site in Raleigh and a site here. Raleigh is fairly close to Charlotte. And whenever it snowed in Raleigh and snowed in Cincinnati, it would be, you Cincinnati guys got to get in. And all the Raleigh people were off work. So there I am in my 2-wheel drive sports car, driving down the highway that's covered in snow.
Yeah.
Going to work. So Cincinnati has the opposite problem. We're too far south to really get a lot of snow.
Yep.
Like you said, the people up in the Great Lakes, they're kind of laughing at us. And we're far enough north to where the city knows, like the state of Ohio generally knows, here's how you deal with snow. And so city seems to have all the salt, all the things that they need to have. So it's taken care of.
Can we comment briefly on the ridiculous amount of salt that ODOT has put on our roads? It is unbelievably my car traction control has activated more because of salt patches than it has snow. It's unbelievable how much salt to the point where my cabin aero filter can't filter it all out. and I am coughing because of all the salt residue that gets kicked up by the cars on the highway. Are you getting this? Or am I the only one?
I don't know about the residue, but it's certainly salty out there.
You go outside. You just go outside on your way out the door today. Go outside and just take a deep breath. You're going to taste salt, especially where our office right by. Anyway, just a mild complaint. I've always disliked the snowplow drivers and the salt because when I was a kid, they were the reason why school opened. And now as an adult, they're the reason why I have to put so much money in Mike's car wash. So it's like, can we just cool it on the salt, guys? Come on. We don't need that much. They're salting the roads.
We didn't use salt in Charlotte when I was a kid.
Oh, yeah.
There was no salt.
Yeah. Well, did you hear Nashville got 7 inches of snow last week?
I believe it.
Not last week, but the week prior.
That storm was really south of, we were kind of the northern, the Ohio River divides southern Ohio and northern Kentucky. Mm-hmm. And I think there's something, this isn't a meteorology podcast, but I think there's something to that river and how it changes the atmosphere. Because we tend to, if something drifts right below us, it tends to go right below us, in northern Kentucky. So I'm not surprised to hear Tennessee. I'm sure a lot of Kentucky. I'm sure they all got pretty well taken out.
Oh, man, they were shut down for several days down there because they don't have all the snow removal equipment that we do. Up
far
here,
north,
ODOT and all the landscapers out there, they're some of the most excited people when it comes to a little bit of snow. They're all out there at 3 a.m, just dumping all sorts of stuff on the roads, and they're just in my little cul-de-sac, the snowplow came through Friday morning like 3 times. It's like, dude, you got it the first time. Anyway, so yeah, we had exciting time this weekend. Did you do any sledding or anything? Or
yeah, my daughter did, but Shep was inside. He was not having it. So
my kids went outside and they had snowball fights, and then lots of tears. Lots of tears came in. I had to shut it down 1 or 2 times.
Oh no!
I got my oldest son he thinks he's playing with a bunch of teenagers. He's just chucking big old snowballs right at his brothers, and they're about half his size. So
oh no,
we had to.
Guys.
Yeah, they know what they're getting into. I told them, I was like, as they're getting ready to go out there, I told my 2 little ones, I said, you're going to come back in here crying because Barrett's going to throw the snowball too hard at you. And they said, I don't care. I know. Apparently they do. So lots of fun to be had. It was definitely a good experience. It's always fun to get the first snow, but then you get sick of it real quick. So far, let's talk about, stocks, what they've done year to date and where we finished up the year. I know you have some stats for us, and I think everybody was glad to see what happened last year in their portfolios.
Moving from fresh powder to fresh all-time highs.
Yes.
So markets last Friday had a heck of a rally to end up closing the day at a new all-time high. So for some context, we ended up peaking. The previous peak was literally the first day of 2022. Markets opened in 2022 at highs, and they proceeded to sell off. And 2022 was pretty much characterized by high inflation, the Federal Reserve hiking rates faster than ever before, and stocks really getting just pretty bludgeoned as a result of what was going on in the bond market. So 2022, we had a pretty miserable year. 2023, we actually ended up, the S&P for 2023 was positive 24%. The NASDAQ was up roughly 43%. I've got my Y charts data here. And the Dow was up actually not a little less than 12%. So last year, basically, we came to terms with the fact that the Federal Reserve was going to not have to continue hiking, right? So we got to 5.25%, 5.5% rates on their federal funds rate. They've signaled that that's going to be where they stop. Inflation has continued to come down. The unemployment rate has stayed low, right? So these are all, and of course, we can't talk about 2023 without talking about AI and the influence that AI and technology had on the market. So now we're in 2024, It's been 2 years since that peak, and we finally got to back where we started.
Yeah. So, and what made 2022 so bad, I think, for a lot of folks, because it was funny, is that 2020, we had an entry year decline of negative 34% on the S&P 500. and it was brutal, but it happened like boom. It's like the difference between taking ripping the Band-Aid off and then taking out just a little teeny tiny bit at a time. 2022 is painful because it was such a steady decline that just happened slowly. I would say it's like death by 1,000 cuts. And every statement you got was going to be lower than this prior statement because it was just a steady decline. But then all of a sudden, when the Fed decided, hey, we're done, we're pausing here, we're not raising interest rates, then the market just took that as a signal that, okay, the pivot's imminent. It's going to happen. Markets are going to rip.
I think the markets kind of figured it out right around the time that SVB collapsed.
Yeah. What's interesting is the SVB collapsed, but the Fed didn't stop hiking.
So, well, right. But I think the market was smarter. The market had kind of sniffed out what was going on. So for some context for the listener, I think it was March, Silicon Valley Bank, which is a bank in Silicon Valley, had basically mismanaged. Banks are in the business of consumers deposit money. So you come to the bank, they give them your money, you give them your money, they hold on to it. But even though when you log in, you see all your dollars there, what they're really doing is they're turning around and taking your money and lending it out. And essentially, they had lent out the money in some actually government bonds. But the issue is they were 10-year bonds. So they didn't mature for 10 years and they paid really low interest rates. So when interest rates went up, nobody wanted to buy the low rate bonds that were still 8 years from maturity. And it left the bank in a situation where they had people withdrawing money now and the bank didn't have all of the money to go get. And so I think it really signaled just how much potential damage the Fed could do in the system by cranking rates higher. And Silicon Valley was poor risk management, really. I mean, it doesn't take a genius to say, hey, it's not a great idea to buy 10-year bonds when they're, paying roughly 1% or something like that. But at the end of the day, it indicated some of the potential underlying issues in the banking system. And it was kind of a warning to the Fed to be a little bit careful.
See, I don't necessarily think it was the Fed's fault. So the Fed, you got to understand, why was the Fed increasing interest rates? They were increasing interest rates in reaction to inflation. So where Silicon Valley failed was in a duration mismatch. The Fed does very little to control long-term rates. Yeah, they can engage in quantitative easing and they can control rates indirectly at the short end of the curve, and they can affect money market rates. That's why you see the short-term rates and T-notes and things, even lower duration than that, are floating around 5.25% right now. But they have little to no control over the long-term rates. And where Silicon Valley got in trouble was they made a big bet without hedging it against long-term rates heading higher. And of course, we know long-term rates headed higher. So I don't necessarily want to blame the Fed for all of that. But let's not mistake
the amount of money that these banks took in 2020 because of people getting checks, businesses getting checks. I mean, there was money getting handed out. So they had tons of deposits and they had to do something with them. So they have to put that money to work. If you can't make loans with it, you buy
what Silicon Valley was doing is they're making speculative bets on long-term rates. Basically, Silicon Valley Bank failed because of mismanagement, primarily around poor risk management, and then also too because of increasing rates. So I think your argument is that it signaled to the market that SVB happened. So therefore, other banks are probably in hot water.
And there are other banks that are in hot. I mean, they're not to the level that SVB is, but let's not make the mistake that when those rates went up, I don't care if you're SVB and you're mismanaging things. If you are a bank and you are in the business of borrowing money on a short-term basis from depositors and lending money on a long-term basis, and we had 2 years where those depositors were doing nothing but depositing. And now we've had 2 years where a lot of those depositors are withdrawing. And on top of that, those loans that you made looking worse, it's tough on all of the banks. SVB was just basically the poorest managed. So it became kind of it drew the short straw. Yeah. So to speak. But all of these banks were feeling pressure. And it was a good reminder. I think the market was able to figure out with that it did mean the Fed was going to, although the Fed could crank rates to that point, it meant we were starting to get to a point where the level of restriction that the Fed was doing was pretty intense.
Well, it was the most aggressive rate hike campaign ever.
Yeah.
So I think that the markets are going to respond to that. and they did. And when the Fed paused, but also too, one thing that we often forget is we say that, it's the most aggressive rate hiking campaign the Fed has ever engaged in. But we just got through the most aggressive monetary stimulus this country had ever engaged in. So, that let's compare, let's put the two together for comparison. So it was, I think, an aggressive central bank response to that fiscal policy was necessary to curtail runaway inflation. And the inflation animal is still not conquered. I don't think it ever will be. I think we're always going to have inflation, but it's certainly tamed down. I mean, how about them gas prices? If you've been looking at that.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, gas prices have come down a lot.
Quite a bit. Yeah.
Groceries.
Yep.
I
don't know if they've come down. I would say that they've stopped increasing so much.
And this is one of the misunderstood aspects of inflation. When you have 9% inflation like we had in 2022 and prices are going up, people think that to get no inflation, that prices actually need to come down.
Yes.
But that's actually not true. You just need them to stop going up.
Yeah.
Right. And so really the truth is of course, there are things like, I think the price of bacon is less than it was than what I paid in the pandemic. I mean, there are individual items, but on the aggregate, prices are going down. They're just not going up as quickly.
And that's known as disinflation. So that's when the pace of inflation subsides. So I personally think that going into 2024 and actually into 2023, I did not see an unhealthy consumer. I don't know about you. My anecdotal observations going into restaurants, you're always fighting crowds. Seems like we're always on a wait list. I've got 6 kids, so I'm trying, not 6 kids, six family
members.
Oh gosh, I can't think about having 6 kids, but all right, 4 kids, 2 adults. Whenever we go into a restaurant, it is an event because restaurants only have, most of their tops are for 4 people. So normal families that that have, a party of 4. So we're always having to wait like 30, 40 minutes for a table. And it seems like whenever it's prime meal time, like noon or late like 5 to 6 o'clock, we just don't go to restaurants anymore because we have to wait 45 minutes because there's always a crowd. And I think that is a pretty good, litmus test. Yeah. For how the economy is doing. Also too, you love Costco. We both love Costco. When's the last time you went to Costco and it wasn't standing room only? It is always packed. There's never a slow time at Costco. So the consumers out there spending money, it seems to me that they're, ever since the pandemic, you're seeing the trends of spending go more towards services than manufactured goods. I don't know if you have any evidence on Y charts to suggest that, but that's just my observation. So going into 2024, I think I'm seeing a consumer that's really strong. We've got the stock market at the U.S. stock market. Let's be very specific about that.
Global stock markets are doing really well right now.
Not the Chinese stock market. I'm looking at just quick observation here on another Y charts here from January. Let's see here. January of 2014 to January of 2024, the S&P 500, the SPY, which is an ETF that tracks that index, is up a cumulative 206.8%. Whereas an ETF known as the FXI that tracks the Chinese large cap stock index, that has actually lost money. That's down 23%. Can you believe that? So the U.S. stock market has really done incredibly well, especially relative to international options, notably emerging markets, which are dominated by China.
Meanwhile, in Japan, meanwhile in India, Europe. Meanwhile in Germany, in Italy, in the UK, in the US, we're all hitting all-time
highs. So, which back on track, that leads me to the point that I was making. So you've got that. Then you've also got this huge run up in home values, which everybody's complaining about for new home buyers, but nobody's talking about what that means for existing homeowners.
Yeah, there's Visual Capitalist did a piece on this, and it looks at the price of renting a home versus buying a home in the US. And for about a decade prior to 2020, it was actually cheaper to buy than it was to rent.
Yeah.
As of the last couple of years, that has completely flipped on its head. It's now 50% more expensive to buy a house than it is to rent a house.
Yeah, that says something. And so that's really been the bane of a lot of not new homeowners, but people who want to be new homeowners exist. And so, I'm always watching my X feed for interesting tidbits of information. And almost every day there's someone on there complaining about the fact that home prices are as expensive as they are. I don't personally see that turning around though. So I think that if you look at I'm looking at the same chart. It's a wonderful chart, by Visual Capitalist here. It looks like it sources its data from Reventure Consulting, Zillow, Case-Shiller, BLS. So it's a variety of different.
I think this is from last September even. So I mean, it's
probably gone up since then. But the average cost to buy a home. So this would be the mortgage payment for the average home in the U.S., which is analysis of averages is average analysis, as they say. So take this with a grain of salt. Your market's going to be different, but it's $2,697 a month, whereas the average cost of rent is $1,845. So if you're wanting to be a homeowner, I mean, it's never been more expensive to make that leap.
So there's a rule in financial planning. There's a rule of thumb that basically says that you don't want your mortgage payment to be more than 28% of your gross monthly income. So given that we know the average mortgage is about $2,700 a month?
Yes.
So what does that mean the average income needs to be to support that?
All right. So it's 2,700 times 12. Let's divide that by point, was it 2.8?
2.8.
Yeah, 2.8. Okay. So it looks like $115,714.28. So that's actually higher than the average household income in the US. So the average household income looks like I had that stat up here recently. It was like 110,000 something a year. No, the average household income in 2023 was $106,270 according to the U.S. Census Bureau.
Interesting. So essentially, if you look at, again, just the rules of thumb, when you study financial planning, you pass a test called the CFP, become a certified financial planner. There's rules in there, rules of thumb about debt. So 28% of your gross income no more than 28% of your gross income should be spent on housing cost. And it sounds like as a whole, on average, we've ticked slightly higher than that.
Yep. Well, according to the U.S. Census Bureau in 2023, the average household income, now this is households, this is not individual income, So the average household income in 2023 was actually above that, is $106,270.90. So the median household income, however, so the median, if for those of you who aren't familiar, so the median is the most common versus the average.
Midpoint.
Yeah. So so the median income is lower, is 74,202. But of course, they don't. This particular data point doesn't separate homeowner versus renter.
Even though the mortgages have gotten a lot more expensive, it's in terms of kind of broad ratios, it's still not totally nuts.
Yeah.
Relative to people's income.
Yeah, it really isn't. And that's what I've always said, because if you look at that last decade, especially from the time from like 2009 when everything was falling apart, really things got better in 2010 because that's when the great financial crisis was more in the rearview mirror. So for about 2010 to I'd say about 2019 was the golden decade to buy a home, because the cost of home ownership was significantly less than the cost of rent, as per that chart by the Visual Capitalist. But also mortgage rates. I mean, that was zero interest rate policy years, otherwise known as ZIRP. So that was when you could get a mortgage, a 30-year mortgage for like 3%. I know people that even have it less. I know some folks that got a 30-year mortgage at 2.75.
Well, and if you didn't during that decade, you had your opportunity to in the last few years.
Oh yeah. So really, it's the run up of home values plus the run up in mortgage rates. So I was looking at Freddie Mac's chart over the weekend, and mortgage rates have come down. So they peaked out last November at 7.79%, which was like a 30-year high. Actually, when you look back from the data, if you go to Freddie Mac and look at this, the data from 1974, I mean, the people that were buying homes in 1984 were laughing at us because it was over 15%. So the average rate for a mortgage from like 1974 to 1994 was consistently over 7%. So this is not abnormal. As far as, the past 50 years is concerned. What was abnormal was the past decade, really. But the mortgage rate right now for a 30-year is around 6.6%. Of course, results may vary depending on your credit. And the 15-year is about 5.76%. So definitely not at the peaks, heading down a little bit. I think that's going to put further the fact that it's come down a little bit going into this summer. The Fed is... The market's suggesting the Fed is going to cut, which is going to influence possibly long-term rates. That's yet to be seen, because I think what people are not counting on right now is just the amount of Treasury issuance that Janet Yellen has to successfully auction. And that is going to just flood markets with Treasury notes that could push yields higher. And I think that's what mortgages are going to be priced off of more so than not. So even if the Fed cuts, you could still see an environment where mortgage rates go up, but that's yet to be seen. We'll see that.
Historically, mortgage rates are closely correlated with the 10-year U.S. Treasury yield.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly.
And if you actually look at the spread between the two, it had been pretty tight. It had been pretty narrow for a period of time. And last year, the gap between the mortgage rate and the 10-year U.S. Treasury yield got pretty big. So, for example, like back in October, the Treasury yield hit 5% at the peak. Mortgage rates at the time were like 8%.
For some
reason, like a 3% spread.
For some reason, the Treasury, it just seems allergic to auctioning off 10-year notes, because that is the lowest point in the yield curve. But we're not seeing a tremendous amount of auctions happening on that, at least not that I've seen. Maybe I'm just not paying close enough attention.
But why would the banks charge a higher rate than the normal rate that they base off of?
I don't follow you.
So what was happening is that the banks, because there's this consensus view that rates are going to drop, at some point, the banks are pretty highly aware that the people getting the mortgages today are likely to refinance those mortgages. So what they do is they build a premium. They built in additional cost early on, and they did that by raising the rates more than they would have generally above the U.S. 10-year Treasury. So when clients were asking last year, hey, what do you think about the future of rates? So clients that were buying houses last year, we had a lot of conversations around don't pay extra points to buy your rate down. Why buy a rate down that you might be refinancing in the next couple of years, right? And those kinds of,
which you may not be. You do not know.
Historically speaking, if you look at the spread of what a mortgage costs above a 10-year Treasury, it was much narrower than it was last year.
I will say this. That would have been a smart bet to make. But there is no guarantee.
There's no guarantee. So of course you have to make sure that it's fine. Like you can't buy a house with a mortgage that's too high and say, okay, this mortgage payment is more than I can afford, but I'm going to refinance it, so it's not a big deal. You can buy a house that you can afford and say, hey, it might not be a good idea to pay extra money to buy my rate down when I think there's a good likelihood that I'll be refinancing this rate in the future. I think those are two separate discussions.
So looking at the housing market, with rates that I think you and I are both in agreement that they're probably not going to go higher. They could, but it certainly doesn't seem like the market would support it because of the run up in prices. So you either rates go higher and prices would probably have to moderate, or prices continue to climb higher and rates stay roughly where they're at. I personally don't know where rates are going to head from here, but I know if you are in the market for a home right now, you're in a highly competitive situation for one, and two, it's going to cost you a lot more to buy that home. So you should be more long-term committed to home ownership. So now more than ever. So if you're a consumer looking to just park your place, park your stuff at a place for like 2 to 3 years, I think you'd be crazy to buy a house right now. So you really, I think for the price of home ownership, because when you buy a home and you have a 30-year mortgage or a 15-year, your payment is fixed, correct? So it's a fixed rate. If you do the right thing, buy a fixed rate mortgage. Whereas rent inflates generally. So for rent to catch up to average rent is like $1,800. Average home ownership is $900 higher. So for rent to catch up to where mortgages are today, I would say at least 10 years.
Yeah,
10 years of inflation, and you factor in. I see multifamily units being built everywhere. I see very few single family homes being built. They're still being built, but certainly not as many as we did like in the early 2000s. Doesn't seem like they're getting thrown up everywhere, but I'm obviously just looking at my little zone, which is already built out. Could be like in the periphery of the cities where these neighborhoods are going up like crazy. But I see apartment units going up everywhere, which is going to further reduce the inflation of rent. So renting is certainly attractive more attractive now than it ever has been. But let's not just focus on that side of the equation, because we still have a huge percentage of Americans that drive a lot of their net worth from their home equity. JP Morgan suggests that 29% of household net worth on average in the U.S. is purely from their real estate, the real estate portfolios. And you sent me an article over the weekend. I think was it LendingTree or no, it's CNBC.
I think they pulled the data from LendingTree, but
where was it? No, it wasn't CNBC. It was it was LendingTree. Yeah, so LendingTree, according to LendingTree, American homeowners are sitting on, listen to this, $28.7 trillion of home equity. Yikes, that's a lot. And if you average that out across all homeowners in the U.S., that is an average of $334,000 in equity for each homeowner. That's a pile of cash.
Yeah.
So as bad as the situation is for people, home starters looking to break into the market, you can still do it. And I still would recommend it, but just, lengthen your time horizon, to at least a decade. But for existing homeowners, I mean, you're sitting on, probably the largest pile of cash that you didn't know existed. So what do you think is going to happen with that?
I think that the stock market over the last 10 years has really been kind of held on the back of the U.S. consumer, right? People's ability to continue to spend their money has been what's driven a lot of the GDP in the U.S. And when you look at the U.S. consumer today, like if you had a time machine and you went back to 2022, what were people talking about? They were talking about how when you have 9% inflation and you get a 4 or 5% pay raise, that you're actually getting a pay cut. We heard that all the time.
Oh, yeah.
Now you get the other side. Wages are actually going up faster than inflation now.
Yes.
And there's more money in houses, and housing represents, the average American has like a savings account, a home, and maybe a 401k plan, right? And so when you think about the wealth that's locked up in people's houses and the ability for the U.S. consumer to keep spending money, there's a strong foundation there. Their income is growing faster than inflation's happening. They've got a lot of money in their houses. Oh, and by the way, when you look at that chart on the housing cost, one of the things that it talks about is that one of the big reasons that we saw such a spike in home rates is because that low interest rate environment happened right as the millennials entered household formation.
Yeah, interesting. Huh?
Okay, so like you look at, anybody that's had kids knows that as soon as you start having kids, your spending changes dramatically, right? Like for me, this is me. I had my first child, my daughter, was born in 2019, right at the end. We had actually heard of COVID when she was born. It's called COVID-19 because they actually found out about it in 2019, even though we didn't find out and we didn't really shut down until 20. Yeah. And so our spending, if you couple the 10, 20%, whatever the inflation has been since COVID, plus the fact that we've had 2 children, and now we're thinking about getting new homes, and we're sending the kids to school, and we're paying for food and diapers and daycare and everything that goes along with it. If you don't think the economy benefits from that, you're kidding.
Yeah.
So it will be interesting over the next few years. We've got millennials that have good home equity, that have rising wages, that have growing families. And a lot of that points to a strong economy.
Yeah. So we basically have a situation into far into the future. What year does the millennial generation? It goes from like 1983 to 1990 something. I forget. It's like 1993. I think it's like is it a decade? So we've got basically another 10 years of the millennials fueling this housing market, being irresponsible like my wife and I and having 4 kids.
But here's the interesting dynamic. So why are the millennials such a big generation?
Well, because they're the baby boomers, and they were the largest generation. Yeah,
millennials are bigger.
Yeah, I know, because the baby boomers on average had 2 children per household. So I think that
more than 2, right?
Was it more than 2? I thought it was 2. Could be.
Well, it'd be the same then. Okay. But anyway, besides the point,
so it must have been 2, like 2.5 then.
Something like that.
My parents had 3, so I'm one of 3. Not that means anything. It's a pretty small sample, right?
The point I'm making is I wonder what's going to happen when kind of the other side, like right now you're in this Goldilocks scenario where millennials are growing their houses and baby boomers are actually starting to spend a lot of money on things like medicine, housing, like, they're aging. So eventually what happens as a lot of the baby boomers move out of their houses and what have you is it will be interesting to see how that impacts the economy at that point.
Yeah. Well, it's definitely going to continue to put upward pressure on on housing prices. And the rents and everything. Another thing that it will do is put pressure on inflation as well. So I don't think inflation is going to go away anytime soon. So the Fed's always going to be fighting its target of towards 2%. And this is speculation, so take it with a grain of salt. But I don't believe the Fed is going to cut aggressively. I think the market is priced in Fed cuts up to March.
To me, this is so. Isn't it weird that the market wants rates to go down tremendously?
It is. I think personally short-sighted, because a low interest rate environment implies that the economy is struggling.
Right.
Yeah. And I think that the economy in its current form can afford these higher rates. I do not see demand collapsing. Do you see that? Because that's not my observation.
I when I look at the market setup for 2024, okay, at least with the way that it's the narrative that we have right now, you have the market, quote, betting on. I think that the other day it was saying that there were like 6 cuts priced in or something like that. Based on the Treasury curve, you can actually look at the Treasury curve and see how these things are priced in. I don't, cuts generally happen, like you said, because the economy is weakening. So if we're cutting rates, we're cutting because we're actually seeing softening. We're cutting because there's a recession. We're cutting because there's a crisis, potentially. I mean, COVID, 2008, those were times where rates were cut. They didn't get cut a quarter of a point at the time. They get cut straight to zero.
Yeah.
So when you look at the market, quote, pricing in 6 cuts, it's really not pricing in 6 cuts. It's pricing in the chance of like 2 or 3 cuts. And then one bit of it's the price of like a cut to zero.
Yeah.
Because of some issue. Now, the risk is that really a good situation? Like the market's cheering, the rate's going down. But here's the thing. If you get the, quote, bad scenario, okay, rates stay higher. Why are the rates higher? Because the economy is churning along. So to me, like where is the downside?
I don't see any. And that's why my base case, regardless, rate cut, rate hike, my base case over the near term is bullish. I'm not going to do what Wall Street does. Wall Street gets into details and forecasts like prices on the S&P 500, which I think is a fool's errand. We can get into that if you want to, because it's somewhat entertaining. But I don't think it's productive to try to forecast that where the market's going to head. But if you look at the macroeconomics, and you see the backdrop that we just discussed, which is a consumer, a millennial. By the way, I did get stats on that. There are 168.62 million millennials and 159.21 million Gen X. Actually, that's million Gen
boomers?
X. That's Gen X, boomers, and silent generation. So that's all in one. So there are more millennials than there are Gen X, baby boomers, and silent generation. So
everybody between the baby boomers and millennials. So how big are the boomers? Do you have the stat on how many baby boomers there are?
This particular stat does not give me just the boomers. I'm sorry. So let me ask that. But let me get back on track. I'll look that up while I'm talking here. So. We've got a very large generation that's in their that aren't even in their peak income earnings years yet, and they're in the household formation stage. So you've got all this demand, down the pipeline. Combine that with a government that is very overly generous with its fiscal policy, shall we say. Which is inflationary. And then you also have this, we still have a global interconnected economy and innovation that is fueling, quality of life improvements. How can you be a bear in this? In this world, it just seems to me that the default is growth. All that cash that's being created by this fiscal policy, by labor productivity growth and that manifesting through wage inflation, that's got to find a home. It's got to be put somewhere. You can't spend it all. Well, I guess you can. You can spend it all, but then it goes back into the pockets.
Yeah, there's only 2 things. There's really the only thing you can do with it that's not good for the stock market is put it in your bank account, and even that is arguably.
Well, then the banks use it, and the banks profit from it.
So maybe you can pay down your mortgage. But then even the bank's using it because they just have less mortgage. Is there anything that if the consumer makes more money and has more capacity for spending and needs to do more spending, in what world do earnings go down?
Okay, before I got to take a break, because this just blew my mind. There are only 76.4 million baby boomers in the U.S. So the millennial generation is more than double baby boomers. Is that right? That's according to the U.S. Census Bureau. I wonder if that's 76. That's got to be alive today. So that can't be because a lot. So there must have been higher than that. Anyway, moving on. But still, I mean, that's astonishing because we've grown up hearing the statistic that the baby boomers are the largest generation that's ever existed. My gosh, millennials dwarf it. I tell you what, those baby boomers, they were busy, weren't they? So anyway, I just am very optimistic on the economy, especially the U.S. economy. Yeah, I think that international economies, especially areas like China has some issues, demographic issues. Actually, are having
for the same reason that we're talking about. China has the other
declining population. Japan had that issue, and they still have that issue, and that's partially why they have stubbornly low inflation rates in Japan. But this is not meant to be a macroeconomics analysis here. So I just wanted to make the base case for why I think over the near term, I think that our economy is more likely to grow than it is to decline. And I think that needs to be said because a lot of the media that I consume today that's geared towards people that are wanting to be in tune with finances is very bearish. They're like, oh, doom and gloom, deflationary, deflationary collapse is on the horizon. I'm like, in what world are you living? I do not see that. I think it's ridiculous to assume that. All I see is you go to Costco on the weekends. It's standing room only. People are pushing out their big screen TVs. People are buying cars still. Yeah, is it at the peak as it was in 2021? No, but that's when the government was literally handing out $10,000 checks to everyone. Like you can't compare it to that, but you can still look at it today and say, well, it's slightly more than it was last year. And I'm interested, if you don't have any comments on that, I do want to get your comments on this big pile of home equity we talked about, this $334,000 in home equity homeowners are sitting on. I mean, that's looking mighty tempting to a lot of people.
Well, so first, the comment that I'll make about media is that negativity sells. I mean, it certainly sounds smarter a lot of times to be negative. And it also is more attention grabbing. So it's clear to see why
if
the news.
If it leads, it leads.
Yeah. And then as far as the home equity, I think that every client has a different situation. Some of the clients that I work with, as an example, are more comfortable with that. Some clients are less comfortable with that. But if you look down and you say, okay, like I'll just use an example of I'll just make something up. So let's say you bought your house in 2019 or 2017 and you paid $500,000.
Yeah.
You're probably sitting on a house now worth $800,000, right? And so if you put down 20% on your $500,000 house, you put down $100,000. If your house is now worth $800,000, let's just make some basic assumptions. Let's assume you've never paid down the mortgage. Let's not factor in home improvements. Let's just kind of look at it simply. You now owe $400,000, which was the amount that you originally borrowed, and your house is worth $800,000. So for putting $100,000 in, you could now, if you sold the house, again, outside, getting about a check for $400,000. So the question is, as the millennials grow up, because I'm in this situation, I have a 2 and a 4-year-old. Our house maybe is feeling a little tighter than it once did. And so there's conversations around, are we really going to get rid or sell our house with a 3% mortgage, potentially buy a house at a 6% mortgage? Those are tough conversations to have. But on the other side of that, in the example I just gave, so now you've got a $400,000 check. Let's say you go to buy $1 million house. You're not going to buy a house that generally is cheaper. Most people upsize when they go to buy a new house. but you want to put 20% down. Okay, because it's $1 million house, 20% down payment's $200,000. So now you've got an extra $200,000 in your pocket. So what do you do with that? Do you put that down on the house? Do you invest with it? And we've had this conversation a number of times, kind of off script, so to speak. And the bottom line is that it really depends.
Yeah.
I mean, if the client's issue is that they can't sleep with debt at all, and debt makes them anxious, and they're really concerned about cash flow, well, then maybe you put the extra money down on the house, have a smaller mortgage, keep them with less debt, because it kind of fills their emotional bucket, so to speak. But on the other hand, if you have a client that maybe lacks liquidity, right? Like, it is important to have money outside of your house and your retirement account for any number of things that could come up in life. So maybe the cash flow isn't the problem. Maybe they could, having a mortgage that's $400 more or $400 less, or maybe that's not what's going to make or break their finances. And by taking that $200,000 and, let's say in a perfect world, investing or saving it, that their balance sheet still looks the same, right? Their net worth is still the same. But when you look down at how they've spread their money, they've got some in the house, some in non-retirement accounts, some in retirement accounts. I think that having that blend is really important as you go through the inevitable ebbs and flows of life.
No, but that's not what the average American is going to do. You know it.
Well,
so like what you're mentioning, the things you're mentioning are sensible. Like pad the cash reserve. Keep some of that equity for a rainy day, just in case, your days aren't perfect, which they're not going to be, which makes a lot of sense. Or put it into the mortgage and have a lower mortgage payment. But what people are going to do, they're going to say, oh yeah, I got $250,000 a gift from the housing market gods. That G-Wagon's looking pretty good.
Yeah, or what I think is more realistic is probably furniture. But let's be real. This is the important part of having an advisor. One, because you are depriving the person in your example of somebody over their shoulder that says, hey, this is the responsible thing to do with this. And by the way, we could still blow some of this. I mean, there's plenty of times where I will tell a client, go blow some of it. I just want to make sure that we've got a process for evaluating how much of that should you be blowing.
Yeah.
Okay. And then let's step out of the, okay, that person needs an advisor. Cause I agree with you, left to people's own devices, it's a big chunk of money. Why wouldn't you go spend it? So, but then beyond that, let's talk about what we were talking about before. Well, if they go buy a G-Wagon, or what I think is more likely is blow it all in furniture, yeah. Right? Because you're going to buy the house and then you're not going to have furniture, and you're going to, look down at the handy downs that you have in your old house, and you're going to look at the $200,000 check and you go, gosh, that Pottery Barn couch or Restoration Hardware looks awful nice now. So I agree with you, but that, back to our core point, only good for the stock market.
So what you're saying is we should buy stock in Restoration Hardware. Kidding. That is not what he's saying at all. I think that overall, a lot of that home equity, that $334,000 per individual, is going to it's going to slip out. It's going to get spent, most of it irresponsibly, to my chagrin, because I am, as you know me, I am very anti-debt. I do not have a home equity line. My house is going to be paid off as soon as possible. I am just allergic to debt. And I feel like that is backed up by a lot of the facts out there. So I was reading up on some studies done by the U.S. What is that? The Consumer Protection Bureau. What is that called? Oh, golly.
CFPB.
Yeah, the CFPB. And then, Bureau. Yeah. So they had a study not so long ago. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. Sorry, I didn't have it. And also the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston. So there's been several studies out there that suggest that having a paid off mortgage correlates strongly with higher net worths and also with just a better sense of financial well-being.
Yeah, but is this a case of correlation versus causation? I mean, I just wonder.
I know, but I certainly feel in my soul that there's some divine influence that's telling me to avoid debt.
It's like saying that people that have more money are happier, which I would actually argue. I mean, there is probably a level with like too little money can be unhappy, but the clients that have more money than they need doesn't necessarily make
what's
you
interesting. I listened to another podcast recently. I forget which one it was. I think it might have been Huberman Labs, where they were talking about happiness and how it correlates. Like the happiest nations are not the wealthiest nations. In fact, sometimes it's the complete opposite. The wealthiest nations are the least happy. But what they found is that what correlates most strongly with happiness is not your financial status. It's that you are in a similar financial status as your peers.
Yeah.
So
it's you comparing.
Yes.
It's basically the keeping up with the Joneses.
Basically equality. Equality is what they're getting at too. So as long as you're somewhat equal to the and that's why social media has deteriorated happiness, is because you're constantly comparing yourself to those outside of your peer groups. You know, most of them are celebrities who have significantly more money, and that can lead to unhappiness. It's just an interesting anecdote. We can move back onto the topic, which is, most consumers are going to dip into their home equity. They're going to pad their quality of life. And who am I to say that don't do that? I know my opinion is
I want them to. I want to help people do that through the planning, right? Because to me, if you look at this, you have a family. Let's run with our example. Let's say you have a family, husband and wife, 35 years old ish. They've got young children. You don't realize how quickly time goes until you have kids. And then you look down at however many kids you have, and you start doing the math on how long you're going to have them in your house. And I don't mean them in your house like until 18. I mean, like by the time they're 12 and 13 years old, they want to go hang out with their friends and do other stuff. They don't want to be around you. How many years do you have where your kids look at you and say, I love you and I really want to be around you? And it sounds so great to say, hey, I'm going to get that $200,000 check when I sell my house. I'm going to bank and invest all of it. I'm going to be perfectly responsible with it. And I'm going to end up being really, really wealthy one day. But what I think is important about financial planning is that you can look at that client and say, hey, you are going to be wealthy one day. We're going to put away some of that money. Here's what we're going to do to make sure that we can continue to grow and stay wealthy. But you also are going to get these years back. And so how can we take that money and use it in a way that drives purpose in your life?
Yeah, I would think that you hit it concisely there. And I think that's a great way to close that conversation up. So for those listening here, if you are sitting on a pile of home equity and you need to know what you should do with it, how can they reach out to you, Brent?
So my name is Brent Gargano. I'm findable. You could find me on LinkedIn. You can find me on Facebook, Instagram. The name of my company is Infinite Wealth Planning. We also have a LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, and then the website is infinitewealthplanning.com. You can find links to my schedule and feel free to set up a time.
Yeah, Brent does a wonderful job. I highly recommend him. For more information about me, my name's Ben Jones. You can find me on X at The Carrot Stick. That's carrot is spelled K-A-R-A-T. So it's The Carrot Stick. You can also find my newsletter on just www.carrotstick.com, spelled the same way, K-A-R-A-T-S-T-I-C-K.com. Thank you for listening. Securities offered through LPL Financial, member FINRA, SIPC. Advisory services offered through National Wealth Management Group, LLC, a registered investment advisor and separate entity from LPL Financial, LLC. The opinions voiced in this material are for general information only and are not intended to provide specific advice or recommendations for any individual. All performance referenced is historical and is no guarantee of future results. Economic forecasts set forth may not develop as predicted, and there can be no guarantee that strategies promoted will be successful. This information is not intended as authoritative guidance or tax or legal advice. You should consult with your attorney or tax advisor for guidance on your specific situation. Brent Gargano is not affiliated with LPL Financial.